Welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be focusing on the war in the Pacific, eh, and the kind of the fight against Japan. So if you've been watching the previous lectures, we spent multiple lectures talking about what was going on in Europe. So now we're going to kind of backtrack in time and talk about what's been going on in the Pacific. And so a lot of this stuff is happening, at the same time as a lot of the battles that were happening in Europe. So the first thing we got to talk about is, Pearl Harbor. Now, we did an entire lecture on Pearl Harbor, so I'm assuming that you've seen that video and kind of have the background of it. Well, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, the attack itself was not necessarily a surprise. Most of the American military establishment kind of anticipated a Japanese attack. Within the near future. What was surprising was that attack happened to be at Pearl Harbor. Nobody really thought Japan logistically would be able to pull that off. And so when we say Pearl Harbor is a surprise, it was a surprise. That is true. But an attack in general coming for most of the people in the know, it wasn't that big of a surprise that an attack happened. The one that happened at Pearl Harbor was a surprise. What most American military experts believed was that if the attack is going to come, then it would probably be in the Philippines. And there's evidence to suggest that the Japanese had been expanding in that area. We see by 42, Japan had taken the Malay Peninsula, the East Indies, Burma, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands. And so they didn't just expand into Manchuria. They've been spreading all throughout the Pacific region. And so the Philippines are kind of this next ripe target. The Philippines do have resources that can help fuel the Japanese military machine and their economy. And so the American military command structure had warned the commander, General Douglas MacArthur, the guy that was in charge of the Philippines, that you need to be prepared. An attack might be coming. Now, MacArthur is going to really walk away from World War II with this great reputation. He's going to be a war hero. I've never really quite understood that because he really drops the ball with defending the Philippines from any kind of potential attack. Right. He's in charge. He's been told to expect an attack coming imminently, and he doesn't do the necessary things to prepare. So you see, aircraft are left out on the runway. We don't have soldiers in high alert, and the attack of the Philippines happens essentially at the same time as Pearl Harbor. And so, the attack of Pearl Harbor is really a double whammy because it's the Hawaii and the fleet there, and then the Philippines as well. And so, the American soldiers in the Philippines are going to fight bravely, but MacArthur is going to be forced to flee. And so he will escape, leaving his troops behind. And, he gives his very public statement, I shall return, and he'll make good on that promise. But the troops that are left behind are going to fight very valiantly. But when they get captured, they're then subject to Japanese prisoner of war camps. They're going to be put on, these death marches. They're going to be treated absolutely brutally. They're going to be tortured and killed. Many of them aren't going to survive. 90,000 troops get left behind. Now, when, MacArthur does push the American command structure to focus on the Philippines, and he will eventually return. But, that doesn't change the fact that the Americans under his command should have been much more prepared for an attack than what they actually were. So the Japanese are rapidly expanding. At this point, they, recognize that the American military might is going to be focusing on them, and so their next area that they're going to expand into is actually a misdirect, and that's going to be the Aleutian Island chain. And so, the Aleutian Island chain, you can see from the map here, is this chain of islands that kind of looks like a tail that comes off of Alaska. And so, not populated, or at least not heavily populated. Some of those islands are completely unpopulated. Some of them have very small populations, but it's essentially that chain of islands that reaches all the way over into Russia, or the Soviet Union back then. And so Japan is actually going to invade and capture a couple of these small islands. And so, a lot of people don't know this. Everybody knows that America was attacked during World War II. Very few people actually know that America was actually invaded and American territory was captured by the Japanese. And so the Japanese attacking the Aleutian Island chain, not because they really care about the Aleutian Island chain, but they want to make the American, government believe that an attack is imminent on our West Coast. So, Alaska is certainly resource rich with oil, so that makes it a prime target. There's this tremendous fear in America that California is somehow at risk. And so we talked about in previous lectures yellow peril, and this belief of the fifth column of sympathetic Japanese Americans that are going to rise up and help conquer California for the Japanese. Like, it's a totally irrational fear, but it's a fear nonetheless. And so the idea is that if Japan attacks these islands, then we'll send our fleet there to liberate them. And so Japan is really only committing a very small portion of its military to the Aleutian Island chain. And they're hoping that we're going to overreact and send our entire fleet to the area, which will then take our fleet away from the islands that they're really looking for, which is Midway. If you can establish bases at Midway, then you really have a door to getting to Hawaii and actually being able to conquer Hawaii. And so the Japanese send their forces to the Aleutian Island chain, hoping to draw out our forces and commit us in a misdirect to open up available places elsewhere for them to attack, for the Japanese to attack. Now, the American military won't buy it. We're not going to be tricked, although the American public is going to kind of freak out a little bit. And they're going to believe this is, that we're all of a sudden now vulnerable because of this invasion. But the military that, intelligence has broken Japanese codes. We're listening into what they're doing. And so we don't buy this. As a matter of fact, we just kind of ignore it, basically. Eventually, about a year later, we're going to send some forces to clear them out. But it really, from a military perspective, this is all just kind of a joke. Now, from a civilian perspective, many Americans view this as a slight. It's a blow to American morale. Anytime you have your territory conquered, it doesn't sit well with the civilian population. And so it will have that kind of effect. But for the most part, this won't work. But it is an interesting trivia fact that, yes, America was invaded by the Japanese during World War II, and American territory was conquered, at least for a little while. So America ignores this, and we're going to really kind of focus our attention and energy where it really belongs, which is in the Midway region. And so the we'll see America. We talked when we in the lecture about Pearl Harbor about our symbolic attack of Doolittle's raid. The Japanese called that the Do Nothing raid, not the Doolittle raid, because they believed it really didn't accomplish much. That's true, except it did make Americans feel good, like we punched back. Like if you hit us, we'll hit you back. So there is a morale builder there. But strategically, Doolittle's raid actually hurt us more than it helped us, because we all of a sudden we showed our hand to the Japanese that we are capable of getting our aircraft carriers close enough for an attack on the mainland. And so the Japanese will build a defensive perimeter around Japan. So after Doolittle's raid, we're not going to be able to sneak an aircraft carrier within that 600-mile range of the island of Japan. And that's key, getting within 600 miles of the Japan itself, because that's about the range of our long range bombers. And so, the Japanese, because of Doolittle's raid, are actually going to end up becoming more fortified, which is going to be a problem for us. So, the Japanese, they get attacked. They don't really care. They shore up their defenses. And like I said earlier, their focus then becomes on Midway Island. If the Japanese can establish a base on Midway Island, then that means the next target can be Hawaii. And if you control Midway and Hawaii and the Philippines, you pretty much control the majority of the Pacific. And so that's what Japan is looking for. So Japan's hoping that we're going to be focusing on the Aleutian Island chain, and they're going to attack us at Midway. Now, America understands that, and so we're going to start to be defending. We're actually going to set a trap at Midway for them, and so the Japanese are kind of juggling two things. They're going to want to focus on Midway, and then they're going to want to focus also down south on Australia. Australia is resource rich, and so the Japanese want to be able to establish control of Australia. It does two things. It serves two purposes. If they can get their hands on Australia, it will kind of close out the southeast area of the Pacific that they've started to establish control over, and so it'll allow them to get the resources from Australia. But more importantly, it doesn't just give Japan more resources; it takes resources away from the British Empire and the Allies, and so it's kind of a double whammy. And so the Americans know that this is going to be a threat, and the Japanese send their fleet on its way to Australia to try and be able to capture that territory. We are going to, again, because we have the Japanese codes, we're going to be able to anticipate that, and we're going to get our first air-sea battle of the war, first legitimate air-sea battle. And what I mean by that is two different battle groups are going to come together at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese and the Americans, and the aircraft carriers are going to launch their airplanes. We're going to see dogfights in the air to control the air, and planes trying to blow up destroyers and aircraft carriers. And so we've never actually seen a full bore air sea campaign. I might have said land sea. I meant air sea campaign. This is the first air sea campaign of the war. It's going to last about 4 days, and the airplanes that are used in this to attack ships, they don't really know how to do it yet. They're figuring all of that stuff out. So it's not going to be, it's the strategies and techniques that they're using aren't going to be flushed out. They don't really know how best to attack aircraft carriers. They don't know these things, but because the Allies know what's happening and we're able to kind of surprise the Japanese here, we're going to see that the Americans are going to be able to turn back the Japanese, and so this effectively saves Australia from the Japanese. So this is a huge victory for the Americans. So once we've turned back the Japanese from Australia, their focus then becomes on Midway, and we get the next major battle of the war in the Pacific, which will be the Battle of Midway. Right? I've told you why Midway is important. It's the door to Hawaii, and once again, America, because we have the codes, we're able to anticipate what the Japanese are going to do, and this ends up being a pretty decisive battle for the Americans. And it's not necessarily because we whooped the Japanese so bad. The Japanese are great fighters. They've got great pilots. They have great, technology. And so their war machine is pretty serious. But the problem is their industrial capacity just can't match America's industrial capacity. And so for every ship we sink of theirs, it is very hard for them to build a new ship. For the Americans, on the other hand, we're able to pump out material so much quicker than the Japanese that we can afford to take losses that the Japanese can't. And so the Battle of Midway really becomes a turning point in the war in the Pacific. It's the point where we start to really realize that the Americans have the advantage, and we're probably going to be able to win this war. The problem with that is, even though that this is a very significant victory that is going to significantly wear down the Japanese, because of their moral code and their sense of honor, they're just not going to give up. And so just because this is the Battle of Midway becomes the point where America really starts to go on the offensive and we really start to wear them out, doesn't mean that the fighting from this point is going to get any easier. As a matter of fact, the opposite happens. A lot of the fighting gets even tougher. And so, Midway, Admiral Nimitz is going to be able to sneak attack the Japanese fleet. We're going to be able to sink 4 fleet carriers, aircraft carriers, and 322 of their aircraft, and destroy 322 of their aircraft, even though the Americans are outnumbered 4-1. So this is a legitimate victory here. I mean, we do really well, but pay attention to that aircraft number, because it's not the number of airplanes that we destroy that's important. It's the number of pilots that are killed. You destroy these airplanes and you kill the pilots. Japan is, they're pumping out a lot of airplanes. They've got more airplanes than they have trained pilots. And so as we start taking out their trained pilots, the Japanese are going to get desperate for pilots. And that'll be a factor later on when, the Japanese truly start to get desperate. And so there is a video attached to the PowerPoint. I'll put the PowerPoint up on my website. So if you want to watch the video, you can. It's a pretty good one. So Nimitz is able to get the surprise attack, pull it off. And so now all of a sudden America is on the offensive. And so there's kind of 2 different strategies that America is going to use to defeat the Japanese. There's 2 different views. Guys like MacArthur are going to push for an overland view. He's going to want to take the Philippines, march up the Philippines, jump into, Korea, push up Korea, take mainland China, and then jump over to Japan, taking away all those resources as we go. And so, he's going to push for that. And he's going to kind of get that. We are going to do that at least a little bit, but the main focus is going to be on island hopping. And island hopping is essentially exactly what it sounds like. We're going to start to push towards Japan, taking one small island after another. So starting on this island, hopping to this one, then to this one, and then to this one, slowly getting closer and closer to Japan. Remember, we have to get within that 600-mile radius of Japan and be able to set up airfields there. And that means we've got long-range bombing capabilities to bomb Japan proper, right, to be able to get to Tokyo. And so we will start our major offensive, right? The major focus is going to be the island hopping campaign. Now, the Japanese have had time to dig in and to be able to defend these islands, and the Japanese are going to defend these essentially to the last man. I mean, it's absolutely crazy how, how much they dig in and refuse to surrender. You're going to see suicide charges. You're going to see guys that, dig themselves essentially into little foxholes and just, will refuse to come out, making it very difficult to clear these islands. And so the American death toll taking each one of these little bitty islands that are almost insignificant just becomes, essentially unsustainable, right? We're losing way too many men to take, these little bitty tiny islands. And so the island hopping campaign really starts the Battle of Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is, in the Solomon Island chain. It is like a communication center. And so where we want to be able to, if we can control Guadalcanal, it will keep communication lines open with Australia and help to further protect Australia. And so the Japanese are going to fight tremendously hard here. Eventually, we will be able to take Guadalcanal. This is another very important battle, not just because we're protecting Australia, but because during the fighting for Guadalcanal, Japan is going to lose about 2/3 of their trained, experienced pilots. And so, again, it's going to leave them with more planes than pilots that know how to fly them. And so, and like I said, that'll be important a little bit later. And so now, after Guadalcanal, we're essentially going to spend the next 2 years jumping from one island to the next, fighting with some of the absolute toughest fighting of the entire war. And so you could see a map here right above my head right there. You could see the attack at Pearl Harbor right over here. The red dot, that's where the Battle of Midway happened. So you can see what I was talking about. If you take Midway and you can put military bases on Midway, Pearl Harbor then becomes, Hawaii becomes your next target. So once we have that, we're going to start jumping through the Marshall Islands. We're going to go through Guam, and we're going to head towards Japan proper, right over there. And so you can see down at the bottom that other little red dot. That was the Battle of the Coral Sea that we were talking about. You can see how close the Japanese got to actually being able to get to Australia. So that battle becomes really important. And so the idea is, once again, get to a place where we're within that 600-mile range of Japan. Two very important islands that are close enough to Japan to be able to attack and bomb Japan are Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Japanese know that those are two very important targets, and so they're going to defend them absolutely ferociously. So the next big battle is going to be the Battle of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is 575 miles away from Japan. So a air base on Iwo Jima puts us within bombing range of Japan, to where we can actually start dropping bombs on Tokyo, destroying Japan's ability to build airplanes and new battleships and aircraft carriers. So the Japanese understand that Iwo Jima is super important, and they're going to defend it absolutely ferociously. So 21,000 Japanese soldiers are going to be sheltered in on this island, and they're going to choose, the commander at Iwo Jima is actually going to choose a different strategy to defend the island. Most of these other islands, the idea was to stop the Americans at the beaches. Don't let the Americans on the beach, and fight for that beachhead, control the beachhead. And then once the Americans take it, slowly start to retreat into the interior and keep fighting so they, don't control the island. The commander at Iwo Jima is going to take a different approach. He's going to take his soldiers and he's going to essentially say, give up the beachhead, right? We don't want them to have control of the island. So let's dig into a defensive position and essentially make them have to hunt us out from protected positions, right? The island is only valuable if the Americans can control it completely so that they can have air bases to attack. And you can't build an air base while the Japanese soldiers are dug into the interior. And so the American strategy, we think that they're going to contest the beaches. And so what we do is we just bomb the crap out of them, right, for over a week, and to try and soften them up, because that would have worked on those other islands. But because these Japanese troops are dug in, we're dropping all kinds of bombs thinking we're softening up the Japanese, when in reality they're relatively unscathed because they're hiding in the mountains. They're dug into little foxholes, and they're able to survive this campaign. And so 110,000 Marines essentially are going to be able to land on Iwo Jima, and they land on the beachheads, and there's really not much fighting that happens there. And so the Marines are kind of shocked, like, oh my God, what is happening, right? But then when they have to go in and start to clear the interior, they're going to run into some of the most bitter fighting in the entire Pacific theater. I mean, like, you talk to the Marines today, and they will absolutely tell you that their moment in the sun, the moment where they proved their worth, was at Iwo Jima, because it's going to be just excruciatingly brutal fighting. The Japanese just won't surrender. The idea is, and these soldiers have been told, right, if, it's better to die for the emperor, Hirohito, than it is to surrender. And if you aren't willing to make that sacrifice, right, to give your life for the emperor, that you'll bring shame onto your family, which means as a soldier, a Japanese soldier, you're defending the island of Iwo Jima. If you don't give it your all and make that sacrifice and give up your life, your parents back at home will be shunned in their villages. There's social consequences. Your sister, your wife, will be, shunned and might not be able to remarry. Your kids won't be accepted into the better schools. I mean, like, there are actual consequences for people who violate this code of honor. I think we all have the Hollywood version of what, this sense of honor is, and and that, yes, that is accurate to an extent, but it's much deeper than that. I mean, people who aren't willing to make the sacrifice of giving their life for the emperor, their lives and their families' lives are made more difficult back at home. And so these soldiers, when they're told to make suicide charges, they do. When they run out of ammo, we're going to see people like bayonet charging, machine gun installations. And so that's how tough the fighting is. And all of a sudden, you see alarm bells starting to be rung in the upper brass of the military. I mean, people are looking at the body counts and how, the civilian populations in some of these islands are rising up, women and children, using like household knives to attack Marines, and, and some of the women and old folk that aren't able to fight, when, we liberate some of these towns, they commit suicide rather than, be in a situation where they're controlled by Americans. And all of a sudden, we as Westerners, we don't understand that, right? We're all about the individual. No way would we, like this idea of a person living and dying for their country, it's just to this extreme. It's just foreign to us and we don't understand it. And so people are looking around and like, oh my God, if they're willing to fight this tough for this little island, how bad is it going to be when we have to invade Japan, right? And so people are starting to look around and starting to think, it might cost millions of lives, American lives, to invade Japan, right? I mean, people are starting to think that every single Japanese person on the island of Japan will fight and resist to the death to stop an American invasion. Now, that's probably not true, but I don't know how far from the truth it is. And so, people are starting to believe, like, wow. This is going to be extremely, extremely deadly. Well, eventually, the Marines are going to be able to clear the island. Like I said, this is some pictures of the beachhead. We're able to I shouldn't say easily, but relatively easily establish a beachhead on Iwo Jima. But then we have to fight up the mountain. And so, the Japanese have, better defensive positions on the interior of the island. And so we essentially have to fight up. The Japanese have the high ground up the mountains of the island. And so, one of the most iconic images of the entire war is this image of the Marines planting the American flag on top of the island, which signifies that we have actually taken the island. And we did. And something like this image actually happened. This image is actually a recreation. So there's a journalist embedded with the Marines, and, there was a smaller flag that was actually planted under fire. But when the journalists saw this, they wanted a better version of it. And so this picture, although it looks like these Marines are planting this flag under fire, my understanding is that, they got a larger flag. They took down the original flag and then put up this larger one and kind of set up this pose to take this picture. I don't know that makes it any less important. It's a reenactment of a thing that actually happened. But I don't know. I figured I'd just let you know the history behind it. So once we have Iwo Jima, then all of a sudden now we can start the bombing campaign of Japan. We're not going to settle just for Iwo Jima. We're also going to move on to Okinawa, which is a island chain that's very close to Japan as well. Again, the fighting on Okinawa is going to be just as tough as the fighting on Iwo Jima. And so, again, raising alarm bells, for how tough an actual invasion of Japan might be. So we'll start the bombing campaign after we have taken Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and we'll be using the super fortresses, the bomber that you see here, to start this bombing campaign. The bombing campaign is going to be absolutely brutal. We're going to start out essentially using incendiary bombs, similar bombs to the bombs that we dropped on Germany, but in Japan, it's going to be much, 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 much worse. We're going to kill more people using these incendiary bombs during the initial bombing of Tokyo in Japan than the nuclear weapons will. And it's because, Tokyo at the time, it's actually referred to as the paper city, right? I mean, you've seen in movies, the Hollywood's version of Japanese housing. It's made out of a lot of wood and, like there's paper, kind of material there. Don't know exactly what that material is, but I can tell you this. Very flammable. And so, because Japan is such an ancient city, it is mostly wood. And once we start to heavily bomb Japan and their industrial centers, it just lights up like a matchstick and burns. And so we will effectively destroy the industrial center of Japan, creating these gigantic firestorms. that are going to kill hundreds of thousands of people. The bombing is so bad that we're going to see just Tokyo, 2,000 tons of incendiaries dropped that will kill somewhere. The estimates are between 80 and 130,000 civilians, because I mean Tokyo just lights up. We know that some of the pilots that are interviewed after the bombing campaign, that it was so bad that the pilots in the plane could smell the dead burning, and actually made them sick and made them vomit. I mean, that's how horrific this is. Keep in mind, it's a major populated city built out of wood where people are crammed on top of each other. And then, we drop these incendiary bombs essentially on a windy day that just spreads the fire out of the industrial region and right into the civilian population. And, it's just, we literally burn 100,000 people to death. Now, that wasn't the intention. We weren't targeting those people, but what we've come to realize is during this war, we have to take out Japan's industrial centers. Otherwise, we're never going to win this war. And the Japanese show essentially no signs of wanting to surrender, even though anybody, military strategist looking at what's happening, they're on an island. We can cut them off and starve them at this point. They don't really stand a shot at winning, but the leadership don't want to, I'm going to say, don't want to lose face. That is true. What I'm saying, it's more complicated than that. But in general, they're not willing to surrender. They would rather die than surrender and face that kind of dishonor. And so, which forces America's hand to make decisions that we might normally not have made. And so, the firebombing, everybody talks about, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Everybody talks about the dropping of nuclear weapons because it's the first time that it's ever happened. It's the biggest bombs ever. Nobody ever really talks about the firebombing of Tokyo. The firebombing of Tokyo is much more destructive than what the nuclear weapons were, at least individually. And so, very important thing that's happening. All right. This is where we will conclude our lecture today. We'll pick up here tomorrow. The next lecture will be VJ Day, Victory Over Japan. We'll talk about, the dropping of the nukes. We'll conclude World War II. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I will see you soon.